only his life, but the ways that we can think about Dr. Cameron's connection to this broader conversation and theorizing around Black Holocaust. And then what I'll do is highlight the ways that a team of community folks gathered a number of years ago, well over a decade ago, to keep that legacy going once the museum closed. And then we will highlight some of our virtual and then ultimately in-person programs that help to continue to operationalize Dr. Cameron's vision, mission, and legacy through the museum, both in person and in the virtual space. And so we'll kick it back over to Mia to offer that rich tapestries associated with Dr. Cameron.
So thank you, Dr. Rowe. So if I can get my slideshow to go to the next one. So the reason why America's Black Holocaust Museum exists is because of this man, Dr. James Cameron. I know Randy has a copy of his book there. We sell it on site too. So I always like to preface when I tell Dr. Cameron's story that he does have a memoir called The Time of Terror, in which he details his experience surviving a lynching attempt when he was only 16 years old. And so it does a much better job than I can in this short time. It's like talking to your grandfather, the way it's written. It's so approachable. We think any age person can read this and take away what they need to from his story. But Dr. Cameron survived this lynching in Marion, Indiana in 1930. He was only 16 years old at the time. And on that fateful night, he had two older friends who did not survive and were both lynched in front of him. What happened was that night he was, kind of peer pressured to go on a joyride with these two older friends. They got the brilliant idea to rob a white couple that was sitting out on Lover's Lane. A lot of small towns have these where, teenagers hang out, make out points, things like that. And the three of them approached this couple. And Dr. Cameron, then known as Jimmy, realized that he knew the man in the couple as one of his longtime shoe shine customers, a man who had always been really nice to him. And so Dr. Cameron just had this strike of conscience and was like, I cannot be here right now. And he ran away from the scene of this crime, 6 miles home. He sprinted. And over the course of that evening, we don't know exactly what happened, but the man in the couple was shot and he died from the gunshot wound, and the woman survived. Later on, the woman would testify in court that Dr. Cameron had nothing to do with this crime, that he had fled the scene and that he wasn't a part of it. But Dr. Cameron still later on had to serve a 5-year prison sentence for as an accessory to this crime. So what happened was the police came for the three boys and arrested them. And then over the course into the next evening, a mob of over 10,000 white people, some of them from Marion, some of them from around the surrounding area, some of them had traveled to Indiana to demand mob vigilante justice. And they actually overpowered the sheriffs that were there, broke into the jail and pulled out one by one each of these young boys and lynched them right there at the Marion courthouse. Dr. Cameron could see his two friends lynched from the window of the jail cell he was kept in. Then they came for him. At first, a lot of the other people in the jail cell were trying to protect him. He was hiding and they wouldn't point out which one of them was Jimmy Cameron. But eventually this man who had a younger son was scared that his son, who was also with him in the prisons, in the jail cell, was going to be mistaken for Jimmy, and they gave him up. And so Dr. Cameron was dragged through this mob of over 10,000 people who had already murdered 2 people. And he was beaten so badly that later on in his life, he actually had to have one of his kidneys removed. And the important thing to remember here too is he knew a lot of these people. He had grown up in Marion, Indiana with them. And he said he couldn't find a single sympathetic face in this crowd that was brutally beating him, even though he knew a large portion of them. He became so close to being lynched that he actually had the rope around his neck and says he remembers the burn there. And at that point, he was thinking, what would my mother tell me to do right now? And his mom would have told him to pray. And so that's what he did. He started praying for his own life at that point. And he said that this voice rang out over this crowd that said, let this boy go. He had nothing to do with it. Some people said they heard a voice. Some people said they did not. Dr. Cameron was convinced that this was the voice of God. This was divine intervention. Either way, it was miraculous that a mob of over 10,000 people that had already murdered 2 people would suddenly quiet down part ways and let him stumble back to the jail to live to tell this tale. So later on, he was convicted as an accessory to the murder, even though the woman in the couple, like I said, testified in court that he had nothing to do with it, that he was innocent, and he had to serve 5 years. Meanwhile, none of the 10,000 people that were part of the mob were ever brought to justice. While he was in jail, that's when he started to write his memoir, A Time of Terror, which you can see up there, taking vigilant notes, really trying to reconcile with what happened to him and his 2 friends. And when he got out, he went and tried to track down as many of these 10,000 people as he could, go into their homes and interview them and ask them why they were there that day, really to try to get to the psychology of lynching and racial violence in America. He traveled the country, founding several chapters of the NAACP. He vigilantly researched lynchings across America, tried to document the names of people that were murdered, and tried to get the story behind all of it. So really just became a self-trained historian, a public historian at that. And then he founded 3 chapters of the NAACP in Indiana, which has the highest KKK membership at that time. And it was when he was trying to integrate their hometown movie theater that he was getting constant threats on his life and his family's life. That constant bomb threats on their home. And so he's like, we need to get out of here for our own safety, and was going to move to Canada. They had all their things packed up, and on their way to Canada, stopped in Milwaukee for what was going to be one night, and it ended up being the rest of their lives, fortunately for us. And so Dr. Cameron got his HVAC tech degree at MATC. He lived a full, long life here in Milwaukee. And it wasn't until he retired that he took a church-sponsored trip to Yad Vashem, the Jewish Holocaust Memorial Museum in Jerusalem. And after walking through that with his wife, he turned to her and said, we need something like this for Black people in America, and it needs to be in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. So a place where we honestly talk about racial terror, racial violence in the way that Jewish people do with the Jewish Holocaust. And so that's where the term America's Black Holocaust Museum comes from. The first museum wasn't created until he was in his 80s. He had already retired, and he basically built it with his own 2 hands to a place where he could collect his research and writings and really talk about what happened to him and his own experience surviving this lynching. Unfortunately, he passed away in 2006. And then 2 years later was the Great Recession. And so America's Black Holocaust Museum, as it was originally formed in physical form, could not survive that. And it basically had to close overnight. And so I'll pass it on to Dr. Rob now to tell us about what a dedicated group of volunteers did to make sure that Dr. Cameron's research and his endeavors were not lost.
Absolutely. And if you could go back to that previous slide, that would be great. Thank you. In so many ways, Dr. Cameron is the quintessential scholar activist. And not only did Dr. Cameron provide this remarkable memoir, which is its own brilliant primary document. So, we'll get into some of my role as a historian. This primary document not only traces his life, but it also gives us a window into the challenges associated with the Jim Crow era. It gives us a window into migration, not only Southern migration north, but also the small numbers of Black people who might have migrated south and then back north. It gives us an understanding of how Jim Crow resonates and finds itself outside of the South, because indeed, while Indiana feels extraordinarily Southern, it is not classified as a Southern state. But it also reminds us of the promises of urban spaces of the so-called North, and the ways that those industrial opportunities indeed drew folks to those cities. And then ultimately the way the system of racism follows folks out of the South and becomes its own national set of challenges and realities. The other really rich component to Dr. Cameron as a scholar activist, and I shouldn't say other because there are many, you can see the image there of him working somewhat tirelessly in all of the work and paper and books and whatnot around him. But in that lower image there, you see him holding one of the several dozen pamphlets that he wrote about a number of topics ranging from critiquing the Constitution, Reconstruction, the ways in which police violence was resonating in the 1980s and 90s. And so I've dropped a link into our Zoom chat, and I want to encourage folks at Milwaukee Public Library. We have digitized all of Dr. Cameron's pamphlets. And these are essentially historically informed, primary document informed articles that he wrote about and then made available to the public here in the city. And now we can visit those in the virtual space. And that helps lead into the next set of ideas. When I arrived to Milwaukee in 2009, I had hoped to walk into this museum where we see Dr. Cameron there in the upper left-hand corner, that image. I had hoped to visit this museum and learn about, and indeed learn from, Dr. Cameron. As a person who grew up in Indianapolis, Indiana, I would regularly attend the Indiana Black Expo. And if anybody's gone to the Black Expo in Indianapolis, you know what I'm talking about. It is this rich, very comprehensive collection of community-based topics, discussions, college readiness programs, job preparation and job readiness programs, public health concerns, concerts, events in parks. I like to say I was at the first Black Expo. And at one of these, when I was about 14 or 15 years old, I bumped into a guy sitting at a table selling his memoir. And it indeed was Dr. James Cameron. So when I moved to Milwaukee in 2009, a couple decades later, picked up my mom on the way from, I was actually living in Charlotte, North Carolina, ironically at the time. Picked up my mom in Indianapolis, and she said, okay, let's go to the Black Holocaust Museum. We drove by what was this building that looked much more like, there's Virgil Cameron in the bottom right-hand corner. It looked much more like that building, and it was closed. And we didn't realize that it closed. It was before I had become as savvy with the internet and didn't think to check, and didn't even know if, even if I checked, if we would have gotten info about it. We got there, it was closed. And so over the next year or so, I continually thought about the museum. And then, Mia, you can go to the next slide. And then I was having a conversation with a colleague at the time. I was working at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee right here in town. And he said, you should meet my sister-in-law, Fran Kaplan. Fran Kaplan is the third person there, top, yep, there's Fran. And he said, she's been working with this group of folks who really want to bring the museum back. And it includes this collection of about 8 people, but this became much more of a community-wide endeavor. Indeed, we were part of the early, and you can actually tell how much younger I was, because that's not an accurate picture of me right there. We gathered, we engaged with other community members. As a person working at a university, this is a part of my own commitment to engaging locally, but then also the way universities over the last couple of decades have tried to get better and better at community engagement. And so we began to think about how we could continue this conversation as we moved toward the reopening of a physical space. And it became very obvious right away that developing a virtual museum would help us maintain Dr. Cameron's spirit and the ideas that help to inform the physical museum, but just also to keep the museum in the public conscious and to keep a conversation going about the museum. What we did not realize was that in 2012, when we launched the virtual museum, we had no idea the reach that it would have. It ultimately would go on to expand our air quotes membership and engagement with the museum to 168 countries. There was no way we could have anticipated the ultimate reach that the virtual museum would have. And indeed, the virtual museum itself was framed very thematically, and it is still shaped in these kinds of themes. We discuss through this exhibit approach, we have exhibits that explore African peoples. We have exhibits that explore the Middle Passage, and these themes began to take on their own life and energy as more and more scholars and community folks began to add to our exhibits with various informed conversations. We ultimately have a theme around enslavement, and of course the centrality of Reconstruction as its own rich historical moment demands that we have a set of exhibits about it. And then of course the era of Jim Crow, and then Black freedom and Black liberation struggles. And then we ultimately began to get into more contemporary conversations over the last several years. And then we also have special exhibits that don't necessarily fall neatly in either of those categories, but then in some cases they may, but these are exhibits that we just know we need to have regardless of where they fit. And so the virtual museum became how the ideas and the legacies of Dr. Cameron continued. The virtual museum also allowed for us to engage far beyond the city of Milwaukee. And it also moved us into a much more contemporary conversation about museums. You know, where do museums go in the second and third decades of a new millennium? How do we continue to engage folks with the ideas that inform museums? And then how do we continue to push our own boundaries as folks who are leaders of a museum that has such an intense yet important set of topics and thematic ideas that drive it? And what we began to fully understand as we were looking to reopen the museum was how important that America's Black Holocaust Museum was to Milwaukee, Wisconsin. We began to understand how this particular conversation around racial violence, racial repair, racial reconciliation, how important it was nationally. And then also we began to realize that there's some international connections, for example, with the Apartheid Museum in South Africa that we needed to consider. And so a few years ago, with the work of our local alderwoman, Malele Coggs, and a developer, Melissa Allen, there in the right-hand corner, they helped to spearhead the process by which our physical space would come back. And there's a mixed use facility. You see apartments up top there, right in the heart of Bronzeville, a community that we're reimagining with history at the core of that reimagination. America's Black Holocaust Museum is indeed one of the core anchors in this reimagining of the Bronzeville community here in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. And so while there was a core of about 8 folks who helped to lead and maintain and encourage the continued belief in the reopening of America's Black Holocaust Museum, indeed, this was a community-wide effort. And at the end of our talk, you're going to hear from some of those community folks who played a role in keeping that spirit alive. But indeed, it was these 2 phenomenal women who really helped move us to a place where we could have that physical structure. And as we reopened, we had the likes of Danny Glover involved. We had Gina Belafonte involved, Sonia Sanchez. You know, we were able to call on some legends to really help us make sure that the spirit of that building was in the place that it needed to be. And here is a couple of images of the museum. We begin the conversation very much like our virtual museum with the stories and narratives about the African past. Indeed, as much as this is America's Black Holocaust Museum, we do indeed recognize the centrality of Africa and African descended peoples in this journey. We move folks through the era of slavery, and then of course, moving folks into Reconstruction and the Civil Rights era. But one of the really, really powerful and important components, particularly for young people as they come in, is that we do make sure to focus on local Milwaukee history. We want to make sure folks, and our young people in particular, understand the importance of their local history, their neighborhoods, and then also the way that Milwaukee has played a role in this conversation around civil rights particularly through the lens of fair housing. For over 200 nights in 1967 and 1968, young people who were part of the NAACP Youth Councils here in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, engineered a set of marches and protests to demand fair housing here in the city, which led to significant, impacted the development of fair housing policy out of Congress in the late 60s. And so we want to make sure that we are always highlighting throughout the museum the ways that the local is indeed important. And so as we reopened, you can go ahead to the next slide there, Mia, as we reopened, we started to realize, well, it's going to be tough to open the museum during a pandemic where we could not be in person. And so we shifted to some rich digital experiences. And I'm going to kick it back over to Mia to help us talk through how we move through those last couple of the last couple of years.
Yeah, so as Dr. Rob said, it's really hard to choose to reopen in a physical space when well-established institutions are closing their doors due to the ongoing coronavirus pandemic. And so we always were in the virtual space. We were actually kind of fortunate in that way when the pandemic happened, that we already had this robust virtual museum and offering. And so we just really kept leaning into that. But the entire time we were still working behind the scenes to reopen the physical museum. Our plan was to reopen the physical museum in July of 2020 when the DNC was in Milwaukee. And we all know how that turned out. It completely shifted to a virtual DNC. And so we just really had to sit back and wait for the right moment. We reopened on February 25th, 2022, which would have been Dr. Cameron's 108th birthday. And we had over 800 people show up to the physical space on that day. So people were really, really waiting for this to happen, and they showed up in droves. I feel like Dr. Cameron would have been very proud to see the turnout on that day. But yeah, we continued with the virtual space. On the lower right, you can see our book club. This was a virtual offering. We created it in November of 2020. So this is right in the heart of the pandemic, and also post George Floyd and Breonna Taylor. So when a lot of people are starting to pick up books and read about race, especially a lot of white people, for the very first time. And so we wanted to create an interracial, intergenerational space where we could discuss important books about these topics in a virtual format so people could find community and conversation at a time when we were all very isolated. And so the book club has been going on bi-monthly ever since then. I think we're on like our 15th or 16th meetup that's upcoming. And so even though the physical museum's open and people come, we still really try to make sure we're reaching beyond our physical walls. Then we have a whole bunch of the Juneteenth programming we did during 2021 before we were reopened, and still really trying to show people that we're doing the work and that we're here for them. And then you see Dr. Rob there, Danny Glover, Gina Belafonte, and Denise Thomas. And that was also a Juneteenth conversation about the importance of that holiday nationally. And then at the top is our collaboration with the Milwaukee Public Museum on the National Nelson Mandela exhibit that came here in Milwaukee. And so a lot of conversations trying to show that we were supporting that exhibition, and Dr. Rob moderating some of those. We also have several collaborations while we were closed, and as we continue as a museum, we are highly collaborative. And so these are just some of the many partnerships that we've had, even, like I said, while we were closed. We just really wanted to be out in the community, show people that we're still doing the work, the good work that Dr. Cameron set us out to do. So these are just some of the many, many partnerships that we have, and some are ongoing, including this one. And then our physical space is meant to be really adaptive. So we do have our exhibits, but those take up maybe half of this space. The other space is a community room. And so you can see we do author talks. That's Candace Taylor on the bottom, and her book Overground Railroad, which documents green book sites as they look today. And then we have an art installation outside that was at the top. And this is artist Sanford Biggers. This sculpture was donated to us anonymously through Sculpture Milwaukee and the Greater Milwaukee Foundation. And that's one of his pieces called Bam Seated Warrior, and that sits in our gallery today as well. And then right before we opened, we had this great news that also through the Greater Milwaukee Foundation, that we received a $10 million anonymous donation to set the course of our future, to make sure that the museum never has to close again. So a lot of this went into an endowment, and then also purchasing another building, so that way we can have classroom space and space for our collections. Basically overnight when the museum closed, the collections were taken out, the building was demolished. And so now it's our job to make sure that we're taking care of the things that Dr. Cameron thought were important enough to collect to tell the story of the Black Holocaust. And so this new building that we purchased is going to have auditorium space, classroom space, and collection space, so we can make sure we continue to do this good work. And this is that's our grand reopening, the ribbon cutting, and then some of our awesome staff members on the bottom right there. And then I don't know if you want to talk about, Dr. Rob, the convening of educators that we do, but that's the photos we have right there on the left. And then on the right is one of our awesome griots that our griot program just recently relaunched. A griot is what we use for docents. And so this slide is just to show you the work we're actively doing right now that we are open.
Yeah, and I will also try to address one of the questions in the chat regarding Dr. Frances Cress Welsing's work in this conversation. Part of what we know is central, and it was mentioned earlier as part of the introduction there, how these kinds of conversations are under attack. They're being the very notion of teaching and discussing race in classrooms has received significant backlash by the right. And we know how important it is for museums and organizations like ours to continue these conversations, particularly when our teachers are under such hostile attack for doing their jobs. And so what we've begun to do is bring together teachers not only in Milwaukee, but in surrounding areas, so that in response to that question around racism and white supremacy, so that we are indeed playing a role in doing our job to engage those topics and engage those conversations, so that teachers have the tools to teach them in class, so that they can use our museum, both the standing exhibit and the virtual exhibit, to continue those conversations, because we do know that the topics associated with explaining racism and white supremacy are multi-layered. They're very complicated. For example, I like to explore those conversations through the prism of law. I like to look at the ways that legal mechanisms, legal systems have shaped ideas about race and racism. Of course, there are folks who like to get into culture and cultural anthropology. There are folks who look specifically at politics. And so in reference to that question about white supremacy and Dr. Frances Cress Welsing, there are multiple ways in which we have to continue to address and think about and teach these topics. And we certainly are committed to do so, but we have to do so, and we have to do so with our educators, because they're the ones who have direct access to our young people, and we have to make sure we're supporting them so that they can do their jobs as effectively as possible. I know that we are getting close to time, and we want to leave a little room for Q&A. And so as we move toward the end of our presentation, it would be inappropriate of us to not, are we going to do the video? We're not going to. We are?
Yeah,
okay.
We are. I'm just pulling it up in my browser. Yeah.
It would be inappropriate of us to not give our community folks the opportunity to be a part of this presentation, even though they're not here with us in the Zoom. Much like the dedicated folks who are there, we work with a similar set of very, very committed community folks. And so we want to make sure that you're able to hear from them before we wrap up. And Mia, you're muted if you didn't know.
Can you not hear the sound?
Only a little. No, we can't. I thought I heard a little at the beginning, but then it went out.
You gotta click a button when you do the screen share to share the sound. Next one.
Yes.
Yeah, we can't hear it, Mia.
Okay.
Can you hear it on your end though?
Yes, I can. So do you want to try to share it, Dr. Rob? See
Yeah,
if it works on your end?
if you go
Or
to
drop
the
it in the chat.
if you go to the three buttons
Yeah.
in the Zoom window,
Mhm.
try backgrounds and effects or
Their
webinar
sound?
set.
Okay.
Yeah, sound. Yeah.
Let me see.
There we go.
Is the only way to freedom, riding by the hose of a gun. Strange fruit, change the laws, all the laws will change me. And I'm not begging cause I'm not afraid to die, cause I believe.
Hello, everyone. My name is Matope J. Johnson. I am a native Milwaukeean, and we're here today at the America's Black Holocaust Museum, founded by Dr. James Cameron. He would be thrilled to know that his legacy is being kept alive and that we're doing it right here in the middle of Milwaukee's Bronzeville.
There is nothing better than to have the museum right here in Bronzeville. I'm Deshae Agee. I'm the Executive Director of the Historic King Drive Business Improvement District. I'm also a member of the Bronzeville Advisory Committee here in the city of Milwaukee.
Hi, my name is Virgil Cameron. I'm the third child of Dr. James Cameron. I know my dad was involved in this for years. We used to watch him type and accumulate all kinds of memorabilia. Prior to that, Mom and Dad used to travel a lot, and they ended up in Israel. Then he went to the Jewish Holocaust Museum, and this had a profound effect on my father. When he came out, he just broke down, and he told Mom that this is something that we need in America, to tell the story of people and how they suffered. And that launched America's Black Holocaust Museum.
Well, the importance of museums like this has a connectedness to African American history. But not only that, it actually allows us to explore the African diaspora and how that connectedness becomes global. It allows us to have places of remembrance. One of the direct references to remembrance is how the story is being told and passing that information on to the next generation. We see that it becomes super important because it allows us an opportunity to connect directly with the objects. It allows us an opportunity to connect with the words. Through this documentation, we get this connectedness through a material culture.
Hi, my name is Melissa Allen. I am the founder and president of Moore's Development Group. When you think about history, you give context to how things became the way that they are. And you can use that for a platform to make change, make things better. I think it's always important to have roots and bases in something. And the America's Black Holocaust Museum has a responsibility in that. It's creating a foundation of knowledge. And so its role will never be irrelevant.
The museum is a part of not just telling that story, but it's a part of helping people to relive some of those moments, but also an opportunity for people to see what the future holds, not just for them, but for all of us throughout the nation.
It was offered to Dad to bring America's Black Holocaust Museum to Washington, D.C. Dad was adamant about it. He said, absolutely not. This is something that I think Milwaukee needs. And he made me promise that it would remain here in Milwaukee, and it has.
In our present situation that we're in, we find that the struggle isn't over, and that some of those rights and privileges that we sought after as early as 1865 is still some of the same rights and privileges that we struggle to try to maintain and improve upon. An opportunity to live as Americans and do so freely. We know for sure that men and women fought and died so that we could have that right.
When I think about the measure of progress, I don't think about it monetarily. I don't think about it statistically in terms of how much a corporation gave. I don't think about it in terms of what a government did. When I think about it very practically. How do we feel? Do we feel safe? Do we feel connected? Do we feel less anxious? Do we feel less traumatized? It's really on a personal and a people level that we will determine and know our progress.
And the way that the atmosphere is in America right now, I think this is an opportunity to create something that's really special and just celebrate Juneteenth for what it is.
Well, the significance of Juneteenth Day, whether we look at it across the country or whether we look at it specifically here in Milwaukee, becomes a paramount event. People came out in droves just to be with each other.
And being one as a people, black, white, regardless. And this is a celebration.
Put the love up. Where's the love? We need more love. We need more people coming together. We need more inclusive conversations. We're having those, and I see that continuing now into the future.
Happy Juneteenth from the America's Black Holocaust Museum in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. Get excited, get happy, grab your family, and celebrate. This is the best holiday of the year.
Happy Juneteenth.
Thank you for joining us here at America's Black Holocaust Museum, and happy Juneteenth Day.
All right, thank you, folks. We'll welcome any questions you might have.
Is there any questions? Are there any questions here in the group? I think I might have one, at least. We have a couple. I think Randy, I noticed his hand.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Randy.
First, I want to give a shout out to Dr. Fran Kaplan. When I was up there in 2017, I actually met Virgil and his sister. My question is, right, as I look at it, right, is have there been interviews done for Dr. James Cameron's children?
If I can jump in here real quickly, Mia, on this, it was Friday before last, I think, Mia. I actually had the honor of sitting down with Virgil Cameron as well as Reggie Jackson, their head griot, for our podcast, for the next season of the podcast. So I had the opportunity to talk to them both. Virgil Cameron, Dr. Cameron's third son, so he will be featured in our next season of the podcast. But back to you, Mia, to add anything else.
Can you repeat the question, Rich, please?
Oh, sorry. Randy was asking if there have been any interviews with the children of Dr. Cameron.
Yep, definitely. Yeah. So Virgil still sits on our board of directors, and so that's why he's our go-to. We have it in our bylaws that as long as there's a Cameron relative alive and they want to serve on our board, they can. So we have what we call the Dr. Cameron Legacy Seat. And so currently Virgil serves in that capacity. And yeah, so look out for the Lynching Sites Project, the Red Record podcast. Virgil will be featured on there. Obviously that Juneteenth video. And then we also did a series of interviews with community stakeholders in the museum right before we reopened. And so we have all of those. We have Reuben Harpel recorded, another long-term supporter. A lot of the people that Dr. Rob mentioned, that core group of volunteers that brought back the museum, we interviewed them for hours. And so we have a lot of documentation of the people who have historically worked to keep America's Black Holocaust Museum open and towards the reopening. And we also on site have technology where we record. If somebody came to the old museum and they met Dr. Cameron, we have the technology to have them record their own insights into who he was and their visit there. So we're always actively recording history right now.
Go ahead.
I'm fascinated with the idea you have 1 million people in here. Do you have an idea of demographics? And in particular, is it child friendly? I would love to think that 90% of the people that are coming to your museum online are under the age of 18. But how does it work?
Yeah, so we do try to record demographic data when people come through. We've had a lot of suburban schools come through. I would say it's about 50-50 racially who visits the museum, which I think is a really great thing. Our book clubs too, there's a lot of white people in attendance. Also we do have a lot of young people visiting. Our coworker Sydney, who's no longer works with us anymore, but she used to always say that if children could live through it, children can learn about it. And so we do have certain places in the museum where you can choose whether or not to really go there and see some of these really hard to view images. So parents can make that's up to them. But we do encourage kids as young as like 3rd grade to come. Dr. Cameron himself, when he would speak to students and young people that came through, it was a lot of like 3rd grade, that age group that he would talk to very honestly about his story and his experience surviving this lynching.
And for the virtual museum, we certainly don't censor any information, but we do make sure that it's digestible. And I think that kind of gets to the thread of your question there. We do make sure that whoever visits the virtual museum can certainly engage with the content and come away in a very short amount of time, deeply, more or less, deeply informed about a particular topic.
We do have another question that came in online, but before that, we did have a comment I wanted to highlight just really quickly. Miss Linda Glassberg just wanted to raise up the Mothers of Gynecology statues that are at the lynching museum down in Montgomery, Alabama. Just wanted to call that out and bring awareness to their movement, the ADOS Advocacy Foundation under President Yvette Carnell. Thank you, Linda, for that. I did put my email in the chat. Perhaps you can reach out to me separately and we can talk more about that. The other question in the chat was, are you guys connected in any way with any other small museums?
Well, that's why we're talking to you all tonight, because we see you all as part of this broader, important community, not only museums, cultural organizations, community organizations. We actually have an intern who's sort of working on some of that stuff for us. Mia mentioned her experience as a public historian. We certainly know the importance of the value of smaller museums, the importance of them for telling the discrete stories that they tell, and then also the importance of connecting across regions, geographies, and oceans for that matter. And we're also a part of obviously state and national museum-based organizations. And so that helps us connect. And Rich, we got to revisit the convening in Indianapolis. I mean, that was a great example of how smaller local entities can connect with one another, engage with the topics and themes that inform what we're up to, and at the same time build these kinds of coalitions and partnerships.
I had a couple of questions. You mentioned the convening of educators. If you could talk a bit more about that and how that came about.
Absolutely. We know that the museum, in Dr. Cameron's purest vision, is intended to educate first and foremost. While we have a community space for social activities, while we certainly have to be a part of corporate circles and fundraising and all of that, just to keep our doors open, to keep them open for long term, our fundamental job is to educate folks. And the people who we are really here to serve, and we're here to serve the entire communities, all of the communities, but we are here for our young people. Just as an example, we will have somewhere between 5,000 and 7,000 7th graders come through the museum next year. And so what we have to do is to make sure that prior to young people coming to the museum, while they're at the museum, and after they leave the museum and go back to their classes or homes, that they are getting a full experience that's connected across those moments, so that they come prepared for the content, they can engage with the content and their own curricular materials at school. And then when they go home or go back to school, there's some debriefing and that learning continues. And so the convening of educators is really our ecosystem of educators in the Milwaukee area who agree, want to, are committed to teaching and continually engaging with these kinds of topics in their classroom. And we just have to make sure we're providing as much support as we can to do so, and that they are also a part of shaping those curricular experiences, because they know how best to educate young people.
I think that's awesome, Dr. Rob. And we may have to carry on this conversation offline, because I'm wondering about outreach to those teachers, how you guys, reached out to them, or whether they sought you guys out. Is it public schools, as well as private schools, universities, and how's it going so far?
Yeah, we held 2 separate convenings a year ago. One was just for university folks, and because we know we have faculty who want to engage with the museum for classes, but then we have groups like the McNair program, or Upward Bound, or other kinds of university-like entities who are going to filter into the museum as well. But we also know that our HR office is going to bring faculty and staff over to the museum to do trainings of some kind. So we wanted to make sure that we were exploring all the ways that universities might engage with the museum. And so we brought in a number of faculty, staff, and graduate students to take part in conversations about how universities will engage and make the most out of the museum experience, all the way from the standing exhibit to social events. Then we brought in K-12 educators to talk about the ways that we needed to begin supplementing and complementing their curriculum and curricula in ways that would make the museum most beneficial and most useful. And so this year, we now have moved to a place where we're actually beginning to build the curricular modules informed by themes and ideas that teachers taught us as being the best inroads to some of these topics. And then we're also providing not only ways for the standing exhibit to be a part of those conversations, but also the way the virtual museum can supplement instruction. And then also just to give these educators a sense that they are part of a community too, so that when it gets tough, they can turn to some other folks and know that they're in that struggle with some like-minded comrades.
Yeah, Rich, I just wanted to add as far as how we found these educators, it was a lot of them who already visited the museum. So even before, the schools right now, busing is difficult, getting there is difficult. We had school groups show up on the city bus all the way from the suburbs to try to come to the museum. And so we just took down the information of all the teachers that were already really motivated to get to the museum. And so these are the people that we reached back out to help build the K through 12 educator network. The university relationships have always kind of been there.
And also, just as I look in the room here tonight with you all, you know who shows up, you know who's there, you know who's coming, right? We know how those networks work in a very informal way, and you listen to your people, and you welcome them into as much of what you're up to as they are able to take part in.
Thanks. I think I definitely do want to follow up on this part of the conversation. You may have heard during the announcement stage, we have done like 4 or 5 sessions with the Memphis Youth Mission on teaching those kids about what we do and the history of racial violence killings in Memphis in that middle school, high school range. That's our kind of first iteration of reaching out to that age group and with an educational type of course. So would love to talk with you further about that, but we'll schedule that later on. Something else you showed, your partnerships with other groups. There was a long list there, but one of them was with Collectivo Coffee. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, so Milwaukee has a really awesome like craft coffee culture here, and Collectivo is one of the oldest. And they reached out to us during Black History Month and made a special coffee blend for us called the Griot. And they did it a few years in a row, and a portion of the sale of every bag of that coffee went to us. And it's really good. I hope they keep making it.
There's an idea. Okay, I like it. I will ask, you put the link, Dr. Rob, of his pamphlets in the chat. Now that chat can only be seen by the host and the panelists. They couldn't be seen by the wider group. I would ask you to, or we can send that just to be on the safe side. You can just email that to us, and we will send that out again to our community in our newsletter.
Will do.
There is another question in real life.
Yeah, this is easy. You all have a newsletter.
Do you guys have a regular email newsletter?
Yes, we do. Our Grio newsletter is what we call it. So Rich, I can send you that link as well if people would love to sign up. And then if you want to participate, like I said, we really try to do both in-person and virtual events. So we can reach out to all of you guys there, and you can participate in our book club or some of our other virtual talks that we do all the time. We'd love that.
And, Randy.
One more question. We was up in Marquette University, right? There was the Marion Community Remembrance Project. What is the relationship? Because the 1930 lynching happened in Marion. What's the relationship between the American Black Holocaust and the Marion Community Remembrance Project? Because I think that's important.
Yeah, so we have been kind of disparate in the past, but thanks to this convening in Indianapolis, we were reunited with Tori Williams, who's on the ground there in Marion and part of that. And so we are in constant communication with her. She actually gifted us a piece of the land, like the dirt that they collected from the site of the lynching. So now we have that at the museum. And then also this podcast, this Red Record podcast, the Lynching Sites Project of Memphis does, is going to unite the voices of what's going on the ground there in Marion and what we're doing in Milwaukee.
All right. Any further questions?
I'm done.
Okay. Guys, thank you so much. And like us, the American Black Holocaust Museum, you are a nonprofit organization. So if anyone wants to donate, you can definitely find the link in our newsletter, ABHmuseum.org, I believe. And go there and you can donate and further support all the wonderful things that they are doing. Thank you so much for joining us this evening.
Thanks for having us, folks.
Thank you so
We'll be in
much.
touch.
Yeah.
That concludes our July meeting. Thank you once again, guys. Enjoy the rest of the summer, and we'll see you in September. Bye.